Welcome to the Capital News. I'm your host, Alex Kreitis. Today is June 27th, 2019. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope everyone out there is doing well. So straight to the market news. The S&P closed up 11 points. The Dow lost 10. The Nasdaq gained 58 points, representing a 0.7% gain. The Russell 2000, the small cap index, really rallied, gaining 29 points for the day, representing a 1.9% gain, pretty much eliminating the last few days of losses. The Dow Jones Transport also gained 1.3% for the day, and the New York Stock Exchange gained 4.4% to close on the day. Oil remained relatively stable. We have WTI still at $59 a barrel, and Brent crude is also stable at $66 a barrel. Gold, $1,423 an ounce, so a little bit of a gain, but nothing to write home about. Silver, still trading north of $15, right now at $15.24 per ounce. The U.S. 10-year Treasury has been on a whipsaw ride this week, gaining yesterday and now losing 2 percentage points, and now trading, or yielding, I should say, 2.005%. The VIX shed 2.5% and now trades at 15.82. So the markets are still on pins and needles. The markets are still awaiting the outcome of the G20 meeting taking place as we speak. Ceremonies are kicking off right now. But of course, the highlight is supposed to be the meeting between Presidents Donald Trump and Xi to see what these two men can agree on. If they can agree on anything. Will there be a truce? Will there be a ceasefire on this quote-unquote trade war? The markets seem to think, at the very least, there will be a truce. What does that mean? Right now, that's being interpreted as saying, okay, there are supposed to be an increase on more Chinese goods that would come into the United States. What is that number? What is another $300 billion worth of Chinese goods coming into the United States that could be subject to new tariffs? The market is hoping at a minimum, that there will not be any further tariffs imposed on Chinese goods. That's at a minimum. What are the Chinese going to do? We're going to get to that in a moment. But we continue to see how this market is behaving. The Russell took off today, gaining 29 points, 1.9%. That's a big run up in the small cap index. Is that sustainable? Is that on some trade hopes? Was that on some earnings calls? What's going on here? Because we've seen the Russell 2000, which I look at as a better indicator of the overall U.S. economy, because those are the small and mid-cap companies that don't derive a significant portion of their revenues from overseas. Now, of course, the Dow 30, the S&P 500, those corporations derive a significant portion of their revenues from around the world. The fact that we have seen the S&P make new highs, that the Dow get close to making new highs, that the Nasdaq is close again to making new highs, but the Russell 2000 ain't even close. That, to me, is more indicative of the underlying fundamental economic data that we discuss here on a daily basis. One of those points, and it was one of the points that we discussed yesterday, we said we were going to have an update to U.S. GDP for the first quarter of 2019. Well, the final revision came out. U.S. Q1 GDP growth confirmed at 3.1%. We said we expected this to be the case. Why? Because Donald J. Trump is in Japan partaking in the G20 summit. He is in the midst, or will be very shortly, in the midst this weekend of having a meeting with President Xi of China talking about trade. Donald Trump wants to say we're not affected by this at all. In fact, we're doing fantastic. GDP was just confirmed at 3.1%. Everybody told me the United States would never see 3% GDP gains again. Well, here it is, in the midst of a trade war. nonetheless. So we're doing absolutely fine. Of course, we continue to say this number is bogus, but this is the game we're playing. We're in a quote-unquote trade war. The first casualty of any war is always the truth. So this is the game we're playing, but nevertheless, that's the number we have, so that's the number we're going to deal with. So under this, we have the U.S. economy grew by an annualized 3.1% in Q1, following a 2.2% expansion in the fourth quarter of 2018. Non-residential and residential fixed investment, exports, and imports, and state and local government spending were revised higher, while personal consumption expenditures and inventory investment came in lower than initially reported. So, what this means, ladies and gentlemen, you read between the lines, is that Uncle Sam and other states in this country are the major contributing factor to GDP growth. Not this supposedly strong and vibrant U.S. consumer. No, those numbers were actually revised downward. That's what drives this economy. 66 to 70% of this economy is driven by consumer activity. This is what we talk about here all the time. You got the tax cuts that came through from the Trump administration, but we always said, well, how'd they get paid for? They weren't paid for. They continue to blow out the deficit, increase the national debt. Why? Because President Trump is aware of the calculation for GDP. And if he had cut government spending, his precious GDP figure would have fell through the floor. And that's what we continue to see. This is a pickup in government spending at all levels. Federal level, state level, local level. This trade war is a farce. It's a cover story for a weakening and slowing global economy. This trade war has very little, if anything, to do with soybeans and corn and wheat and a whole host of other products. This has to do with the United States being a superpower and observing the rise of another global superpower in China. And the United States doesn't like it, and the United States wants to slow them down. That, to a degree, is understandable. That is the course of history. That's what we typically see. They say history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And that is what we are witnessing right now. The question becomes, how does China play this? Do they want to come back to the negotiating table? Do they want to have a quote-unquote ceasefire? Can they actually sit down and make a deal? Maybe they have 80% done. Maybe they're 90% of the way there. But is that 10 to 20%? Is it a bridge too far? Can these two leaders get together? Can they have their delegations get together and resolve these final moments? I am highly skeptical. This is an opportunity for China right now, if they want to take it, to say, nope, we're fine. You can continue with your little trade war, but we're fine. We're in control of our economy. We can print money if we need to. We can cut taxes if we need to. We can forgive local and provincial government debt and a whole host of other things. We'll do it. Why? Because we can. We're the Chinese. We're communists. They lead. They listen to what we say. And that's what President Xi could say. That could be what he says. That could be the outcome. That would be a power play. I'm not saying it's what he's going to do. I'm not saying it's the right move. But that's a possibility. He could say, look, a lot of the growth over the last 20, 30 years in China has been driven by exports in a large part. There's no doubt to that. Nobody argues that. But what the Chinese are in the midst of doing, what the Chinese want to do, and they admit this, is they want their economy to be less and less dependent on exports. That is to say, they want to be more like the United States from the standpoint that they want internal investment, business investment, and internal consumption to be the main drivers of their economic growth. So they're in a shifting environment right now, if you will. One of being a major exporter to one that says, okay, we're going to be more inward facing. We're going to be more internally growing. That's how we want this economy to move forward as we progress through the 21st century. It's interesting game of politics here as to what's going to happen. It's a he said moment. A couple months ago back in May. What took place? Oh, well, the Chinese walked away. They reneged. Then you have the Chinese saying, no, it was the Americans who walked away. Who do we believe? The serious question. Because it's going to be interesting to see what comes of this. A hypothetical, which I think has some pretty decent probability attached to it, would be for President Trump either at the end of G20 or shortly thereafter to make positive statements that everything's fine. I still have a great and beautiful relationship with President Xi. We're going to get through this, yada, yada, yada. What happens if that happens to not be true? What happens if President Xi should come out and make a statement contradicting Donald Trump? If Donald Trump should come out and say everything's fine, it's just a little bit of a rough patch, but we're going to get over it, and President Xi should come out and say, no, that's not true. We're not going to get over this. Who is the world going to believe? Because that becomes very interesting. Will the world believe a communist regime, or will they take the word of the leader of the free world? Because if they believe the former, we're in a lot of trouble, ladies and gentlemen. This is why I have been calling into question the president's credibility, his statements, his tweets on this matter. It's why I wrote a letter on thecapitalnews.com if you have not checked it out. I also took the time to read it as part of one of my podcasts. Oh, that was already a month ago. So, this is serious stuff. We can forget about the soybeans. We can forget about the corn and the wheat. We can forget about some stupid iPhones that may be sent over here or not sent over here or manufactured in China or somewhere else. It's not the point. We have a president of the United States who makes statements. We do not know if they're true or not. We've been jerked around for several months saying there was going to be an historic deal, that there's going to be a signing ceremony. It did not happen. It has not happened. I hope that it does. I want this president to succeed. But we do not need this type of rhetoric. Because if President Xi should just he wants to play the strong man too, and he wants to say, we can deal with this. Not that big of a problem. We only import so much from you guys. It's really not going to affect us that much. Sure, we export, but we can find other we can find other nations to trade with. Not that big of a deal. We want to grow internally anyways. We'll be fine. We can print money. I'm not saying this is a solution, but if the Chinese actually believe that that's going to work for them, well, then they may be inclined to say that and act on that. Meaning this trade war will continue and it may escalate. They might be willing to do it. They might be willing to call President Trump's bluff. What will that mean here? What will that mean for our agricultural sector? Will that mean more bailouts from the federal government to farmers and ranchers? That doesn't sound like winning if that's what transpires. Now, we had some reports out earlier today that President Xi was going to make, let's just say, an argument before President Trump on a few talking points. Now, this is what we're told. So we're just going to go with what we're told. I don't want to go down the road of speculation on a whole host of other things. But this is what's being reported. This is what's out there. That President Xi, as part of these negotiations to reach a truce, not even necessarily a trade deal, but to at least reach a truce, no further escalation, China wants to see the following 3 points. Huawei technologies, that ban that the United States has placed on Huawei technologies and banning U.S. companies from doing business with Huawei, that needs to be removed. What's the probability that that's going to happen? Quite interesting, isn't it? Because this administration has considered Huawei technologies a national security threat. You have members of Congress who have deemed Huawei technologies a national security threat. So will the president buckle and cave on this one to score some political points with his base, with some voters, to get a short-term truce? It's an interesting question. What will the president prioritize? Because it's already been called a national security issue. Now, because, well, we might get a trade deal that everything's going to be fine and we'll just ignore it. Which one is it? Is it a national security threat or isn't? Or isn't it? Why would you say that it was if it isn't? Again, going to the question of credibility. What are we to believe? A couple months ago, it's a national security threat. Now you meet with President Xi. He says, no, it's not a national security threat. There's nothing to worry about. Oh, okay. I'm going to believe you. That makes no sense because we've been told by President Trump all the time. That's exactly why we're in the mess with China that we're in. Because we've had stupid politicians who've trusted the Chinese. And they've been eating our lunch. So now, I mean, this is the problem when you make these types of statements. You box yourself in. That's point one. Point two, punitive tariffs need to be removed. There ain't no way in hell that's going to happen. It just can't. How is that going to happen? We have the tariff man as the president of the United States. We also have, as one of our major points, at least what we're being told on the U.S. side, is that the U.S. is demanding an enforceable agreement. How are they going to enforce anything? How are they going to make sure that the Chinese are following the rules? Whatever that may be. How are we going to guarantee that? Will tariffs be entirely removed? Because we've had discussion over the past several months that even if a deal is struck, part of that deal is likely to have tariffs remaining on Chinese goods coming into the United States. Why? A method of carrot and stick. We'll remove the tariffs if you comply with the deal. So to say that the United States has to remove these tariffs as part of an agreement, I just don't see how that's going to happen. That will make the president look weak to his base. We'll see what happens. Point three, the U.S. needs to remove the demand that China needs or has to buy more U.S. products. That's another doozy for the president, because he's promised to the farmers and ranchers time and time again that we're going to sell more soybeans than we've ever sold before, more corn, more wheat, more every other type of agricultural product, more cattle, more pigs, everything. Now you have China saying, no, you have to remove that. You're not going to dictate to us in this deal where China decides to buy what, in what quantities, and from whom. And I have to say, that's the right thing for China to say. We wouldn't like it if some other country was dictating to us as part of some deal that we had to buy wheat from Brazil or wherever country we're negotiating with. We say, no. You're not going to dictate to us anything. We are our own nation. We have our own sovereignty. We will make these decisions as to where we want to buy products. Again, this goes back to the conversation we've had here many, many times before, with the example that I've given many times before. Just because a trade deal is signed doesn't mean that the Chinese are magically going to need more soybeans. So where are they going to source them from? Are they going to say, all right, well, before we were getting them from, Brazil and Russia. Now we're going to buy most of them from the United States. Do you think Vladimir Putin is just going to say, oh, well, we're completely fine with that? Absolutely not. So this is far from over. That's why this has very little to do with actual trade. This has to do with a superpower versus an up-and-coming superpower. This has to do with IP theft. This has to do with cyber attacks. This has to do with forced technological transfers. That's what this is all about. That's the remaining 10 to 20%. That's the bridge that's too far. I just don't see there being any type of solution to this. Is it possible? Sure, it's possible. Sure, it's possible. I hope something does get done. I really and truly do. But when you have the rhetoric from President Trump, And now you have these bullet points, and this is just what we know that's been reported. Again, I'm taking this at face value, that this is what we're working with. I don't know how both sides are going to say, okay, we can say Huawei all of a sudden is no longer a national security threat. We can continue doing business with them. Punitive tariffs need removed. I thought that was the whole purpose of making sure that everything was working. And the U.S. needs to remove the demand that China buys more U.S. products. It's not going to look good for President Trump. None of those points will look good for this administration. Not a single one of them. And that's just the 3 points that we know. How many more are there? Because another serious question that comes to mind, and we've had this discussion as well, is only a few weeks ago, we had Donald Trump coming out saying, look, we have the USMCA between the Mexicans and the Canadians and the United States. Fantastic trade deal. But guess what, Mexico? I don't like what's going on the southern border. I might slap more tariffs on you. You think the Chinese saw that? What do you think they think about that? You think they're going to say, oh, well, we'll make a deal with the president. We'll make a deal with the United States. And then we don't have to worry about the president one night over the weekend taking to Twitter to say, there's something else I don't like that China's doing, and I think I'm going to slap more tariffs on them. You think they want to put themselves in that position? This only happened a few weeks ago. Who's to say? I mean, is that going to be another talking point? Is that going to be another one of these bullet points that China says to the president? Look, you have to guarantee us. And what type of guarantee are they going to get? What type of enforcement mechanism will they place on this president to not threaten them with further tariffs if something else should arise somewhere down the road with something totally disconnected to trade? These are serious questions. I hope Donald Trump can figure it out. I hope a deal can be struck. But even if a deal is struck, what does that mean for the markets? There might be some sort of quote-unquote relief rally, but we have fundamental problems, not only in this country but around the world. We talk about these economic data points here all the time. All the time. The trade that goes back and forth between the United States and China is nothing. It is nothing on the multi-trillion dollar economies just between the United States and China, let alone the rest of the world. That cannot cause all of this slowdown. This economy, the global economy, has been slowing down far before these trade tariffs and this trade war. You had a little bit of stimulus with these tax cuts because at least from the standpoint of the stock market's performance, because you had more cash going into corporate coffers. They're buying up their shares, it's increasing their earnings per share. Earnings per share is pretty much the lifeblood of stock prices, so you see them rallying. Diminishing marginal returns are kicking in, as we always say here. The Federal Reserve is trying to thread the needle. They're balancing the tightrope right now. Do we just use rhetoric to try to get these markets to rally? Or are we actually now going to have to make a move and cut interest rates? What are we going to do? And of course, they are waiting to see what happens this weekend as well, because the Federal Reserve will be meeting at the end of July to make a decision. Now, they know, based off of the final revision of Q1 GDP, that it's 3.1%. Well, that's a pretty good number if you're to believe it. We have record low unemployment. We have price stability. That's the mandate for the Federal Reserve. So what's the concern? Serious questions to ponder. I wish Donald Trump all the best this weekend. The markets are either going to rally next week or they're going to sell off next week. It is not going to be in a trading range because these markets have just too much pent-up energy to go one way or the other. They are not just going to be range-bound. They are going to make a big move. What move that's going to be is anybody's guess. But stay tuned to the Capital News. We'll let you know what transpires. Thank you so much for joining me, ladies and gentlemen. Please like, share, subscribe, get the word out. Leave your comments. We do love hearing from you. This is the Capital News. I am Alex Koritis. Godspeed.